So there was a job in medieval Europe, an actual, recognized, somebody does this for a living job, where you got hired to eat the sins of a dead person. Not metaphorically, not in some abstract theological sense. You'd literally sit next to a corpse, eat a piece of bread that had been placed on the dead person's chest, and by doing that, you absorbed every sin that person had ever committed. Their soul gets to waltz into heaven squeaky clean, and you just walk home carrying a lifetime of someone else's spiritual baggage, like a grocery bag full of other people's crimes. That was the gig. That was Tuesday. And I need you to understand, this wasn't some fringe thing. This was a known profession across parts of England, Scotland, and Wales for centuries. Families would specifically send for the sin eater when someone died. There was a ritual. There were expectations. Sometimes there was ale involved, which honestly might be the most relatable part of this entire arrangement. You're about to swallow a dead stranger's adultery and general dishonesty? Yeah, you're gonna want to drink with that. Here's how it actually worked. Someone dies. The family lays the body out, places bread, sometimes cheese, sometimes beer, directly on the chest of the deceased. Then the sin eater shows up, eats the food, and through that act, takes on every sin the dead person accumulated over their entire life. The food was believed to literally absorb the sins through contact with the body. So the bread is basically a spiritual sponge sitting on a corpse, and this person's whole job is to eat the sponge. I cannot stress enough that this was a real thing real people did with real straight faces. The theology behind it is actually kind of fascinating in a completely unhinged way. Medieval Christian belief held that if you died with unconfessed sins, you were in trouble. Purgatory at best, worse options on the table. But not everyone had access to a priest at the moment of death. Not everyone could confess. Rural communities were spread thin, clergy weren't always available, and death has never been particularly considerate about scheduling. So communities developed their own workaround. Can't get a priest? Fine. Get the guy who eats sins for a living. Problem solved. It's like spiritual duct tape, theologically questionable, but functionally effective in the moment. And the sin eater was almost always someone from the absolute bottom of the social ladder. We're talking the poorest person in the village, the outcast, the person already living on the margins. Which makes a grim kind of sense if you think about it. You need someone desperate enough to accept a job where the compensation is a meal and a few coins, and the cost is theoretically absorbing an ever-growing mountain of other people's sins onto your own soul. Every funeral you work, you're stacking more spiritual debt. It's like being a credit card that only accumulates charges and never gets paid off. The pay was terrible, by the way. We're talking maybe 6 pence and a meal. In some accounts, it was literally just the bread and beer that had been sitting on the corpse. So your payment is the sin food. The transaction is the compensation. That's like if your job at a restaurant was eating the plates customers sent back, and that was also your salary. But here's where it gets genuinely dark. Because the community needed sin eaters, but they also despised them. Think about that for a second. You are performing what these people consider a vital spiritual service. You're saving their loved one's soul, and in return, they treat you like you're radioactive. Sin eaters were shunned. People wouldn't talk to them, wouldn't associate with them, wouldn't let them into their homes except when someone died. You were only welcome at the worst moment of someone's life, and then you were expected to disappear until the next worst moment. It's loneliness as a job description. You're a spiritual janitor that everyone pretends doesn't exist between messes. And the wild part is that the sin eater couldn't exactly quit and rehabilitate their reputation. Once you'd eaten enough sins, the community viewed you as essentially a walking collection of everyone's worst impulses. You're carrying the theft, the lies, the violence, the betrayals of dozens, maybe hundreds of dead people. In the eyes of your neighbors, you weren't just poor anymore. You were spiritually contaminated. The theological math on your own afterlife was looking roughly like trying to pay off a mortgage with loose change you find in couch cushions. There's a recorded account from the 1680s by a guy named John Aubrey. He was basically the 17th century's version of that friend who writes everything down, and he described witnessing the practice in Herefordshire. The sin eater came in, accepted the food and drink from the body, ate it, and then the family essentially told him to leave. Transaction complete. Soul saved. Now get out of our house, you sin-soaked weirdo. Aubrey described the sin eater he met as a long, lean, ugly, lamentable, poor rascal, which is brutal, but also reads like the worst Tinder bio of all time. The last known sin eater in England was supposedly a man named Richard Munslow, who died in 1906. Which, hold on, 1906? That's not medieval. That's the same year the San Francisco earthquake happened. That's 6 years after the first Zeppelin flight. Somewhere in rural Shropshire, a man was still eating bread off of dead people's chests, while other people were literally inventing powered flight. The timeline on this is wilder than you'd expect. And Munslow is interesting, because unlike most sin eaters before him, he wasn't destitute. He was actually a reasonably successful farmer. The story goes that he took up sin eating after several of his children died, possibly as a way of processing grief, possibly as a way of ensuring their souls were safe, possibly both, which reframes the whole practice in a way that's honestly kind of heartbreaking. It wasn't always just superstition performed by desperate people for pocket change. Sometimes, it was a parent who'd lost children, deciding that if there was even a 1% chance this worked, they were going to do it. That's not ignorance. That's love wearing the only armor it could find. The church, for the record, was never officially on board with any of this. Sin eating existed in that weird gray zone between folk religion and actual doctrine, tolerated in some parishes, condemned in others, largely ignored by the institutional church, because rural communities were going to do what rural communities were going to do regardless. It's the ecclesiastical equivalent of a manager pretending they don't see employees leaving early on Fridays. Technically against policy, functionally unstoppable. Some historians think the practice has roots way older than Christianity, that it connects to ancient Celtic and pre-Christian traditions around death rituals and food offerings. The Christian framework got layered on top like a new operating system installed over the old one, where some of the original code still runs underneath and occasionally causes glitches. The sin-eating ritual might be one of those glitches. A pre-Christian death rite wearing a Christian costume, persisting for centuries because it solved a problem that official religion couldn't always address. So the next time you complain about your job, just remember, there was a guy whose entire professional identity was showing up to funerals, eating cursed bread off a dead body, absorbing a lifetime of spiritual crimes, getting paid less than a modern parking meter takes in an hour, and then being treated like a social plague until the next person in town died. And Richard Munslow's grave in Rattling Hope, Shropshire? It was restored in 2010. The community raised funds to fix it up, which means the descendants of the people who shunned sin eaters eventually came back around to honoring one. Only took about a century and the complete disappearance of the profession. Timing's everything, I guess.